This set of notes is titled Protists of the Sea. So what we're going to be looking at here is one particular grouping of organisms. And this is the information that I have on the slide here that I'd like you to write down right underneath that title. And this is how we're going to go throughout the rest of the year. Again, I've mentioned this already, but we need to make sure that we're understanding how these particular organisms are actually classified. So for the protists, the domain is the eukarya, so make sure you get that jotted down. And the kingdom within that particular domain of eukarya is the kingdom Protista. For these organisms, that's as far as we're going to go within the classification. There's so many different types of organisms. We're going to talk about these Protista just as two general types. And the two types that we are going to be looking at are the plant-like protists and the animal-like protists. So those are the two general types within the kingdom Protista and the domain eukarya. Now, before we get into those specific plant-like and animal-like, I'd like to talk really quickly about this term algae, a term that we will be using quite a bit, and one that you're probably relatively familiar with. A term algae is a very general descriptive term. It covers this very diverse group, very large group of different types of organisms that have some things in common. Number one, they are photosynthetic eukaryotes. So these organisms, when we talk about algae, are a very particular type, photosynthetic eukaryotes. You should be familiar with that term, eukaryotes. These organisms have organelles within their cell membrane. These organisms are relatively large compared to those prokaryotes, which we talked about earlier. Some of the characteristics of the algae that these particular organisms have, other than being very diverse, is that they lack flowers, they don't have true leaves, they don't have stems, and they don't have roots. The organisms that we're talking about, when we talk about algae here in this particular kind of general description of these Protista, they don't have any of those particular characteristics. You might be familiar with things like stems and roots and leaves and flowers, but those are very specific scientific structures. They're the organs of those particular organisms, and these guys don't have that. All of these organisms are unicellular algae that we are going to be talking about. That means they're only made up of one single cell. They're often referred to as plants, but algae are not plants because they don't have those characteristics that I mentioned earlier. And because many of them often have some animal-like characteristics. We call those organisms that are these unicellular algae that are doing photosynthesis, but have some animal characteristics at the same time. It's this hodgepodge group. We call those the Protista. So let's take a look at these Protista first. Or for right now, the ones we're going to talk about first are the plant-like Protista. We're going to start off talking about the diatoms. Really, we're just going to cover some of the big ones, big by importance in marine biology. And we're going to cover three of these plant-like protists. The diatoms are one of these organisms. For lifestyle of the diatoms, how they're actually living, they are planktonic. That is, they are living up at the surface and floating at the surface of the ocean. They're unicellular organisms. However, they will gather together and make these star-like configurations. Their shell, very important characteristic for these organisms, is made of silica. Silica is the exact same substance that we use to make glass. There's a very good example in the movie Sweet Home Alabama. Kind of one of those plot summaries of the movie. I don't want to give too much away, but there's beaches that are made of silica. When that silica gets heated to a very high temperature, it forms what we call glass. So glass, windows, all made of silica. The beach in that movie, and our glass, a lot of that is from the shells of these diatoms. Now, that glass is important because when you think about windows and you think about glass, one of those characteristics of that particular substance is it allows light to pass through it. So if it allows light to pass through it, And their shells are made up of this substance that allows light to pass through it. Pretty important in how they're actually obtaining food. Allowing that light to pass into the cell allows them to do photosynthesis. So these particular organisms are doing photosynthesis to get food. Now we put that in quotes because what we're talking about in this case with that food is sugar. They're producing that sugar in that process of photosynthesis. These diatoms actually account for a huge amount of the organic carbon, that is sugar, and the oxygen that is produced here on this planet. A tremendous amount is from these organisms. Now, they don't use chlorophyll like plants do. They use carotenoids. That's the colors that the plant leaves are having now in the fall, turning that yellow, the oranges, and the reds, and oh, it's so pretty. Well, those are the pigments that they're using right now. The diatoms use those same type of pigments in photosynthesis. Now, these particular organisms, when they reproduce, they're reproducing through that process of mitosis. That is, they're splitting into two. But we don't have that sexual reproduction here because they're only one cell. So one cell cannot have an egg cell also. That would make it two cells, or a sperm cell. So the only way these organisms can reproduce is through mitosis, that is dividing into two. And when they do that, oftentimes they're going to be reproducing when they're in very good conditions for these organisms to survive. And these good conditions are when there's lots and lots of sunlight, the water temperature is correct, they're not being eaten by predators, etc. When that happens, they reproduce rapidly. We call that a diatom bloom. When there's a diatom bloom, they're reproducing so rapidly that oftentimes they don't reach their full size. And as they're reproducing, they're depleting the silica from the water. So we have a significant depletion, and over a relatively short amount of time, as they get really high in number very quickly, not enough silica is left in the water for them to continue to reproduce, and so they start to die off. And when they die off, the shells, that silica, is going to sink down to the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes it's very deep, sometimes it's not so deep. When it sinks down to the bottom of the ocean in these huge mass quantities from this diatom bloom, it creates an area called diatomaceous ooze. Here's a couple pictures of what these organisms look like here in that star-like form, and here's one single one that is zoomed in significantly. You can see that brown coloring. This diatomaceous ooze is just a huge pile of the shells of these organisms. When the sea level drops and this diatomaceous ooze dries out, it forms diatomaceous earth. If you look on your toothpaste and it says hydrated silica, you're brushing your teeth with the skeletons of these organisms. That's this diatomaceous ooze. That's the hydrated silica. We use it in swimming pool filters oftentimes. They have to put diatomaceous earth in to help filter that water out. We use these particular organisms in a bunch of different ways, but those are the two ones that you might be a little bit familiar with. The second plant-like protista are the dinoflagellates. The lifestyle of the dinoflagellates is very similar to that of the diatoms. They are planktonic. They are also unicellular. But it's a little unique that these particular organisms have two. That's what the di is for. And the flagellates, that's for flagella. Those whip-like, tail-like structures on the outside, another organelle, that sticks out of these organisms. They use the these two flagella for movement, swimming around. One of them kind of trailing free, one of them wrapped around the middle. They also use these to help them capture some food. I'll get to that here in just a minute. I just talked about that movement. That's what the flagella there is for. Their shell, a different type of shell. Their shell is actually made up of cellulose, which is the same fibers made from sugar, carbohydrates. They're the polysaccharides. This particular cellulose shell is the same stuff that plants use to make their cell walls. So these particular organisms have a relationship to the land-based plants. They're using the same structures on the outside. Obtaining food-wise, I said they use these flagella. Some of them are going to be eating other organisms that they can wrap that flagella around and pull into the organism. Most all of them including the ones that do eat others that are heterotrophic. Most all of them also do photosynthesis. So for these guys, what you need to write down is that they are photosynthetic, that is, they are autotrophs, but they also will be heterotrophs. So autotrophs, but also will be autotrophs. When we do reproduction for these particular organisms, same thing, it's a single cell. So they reproduce through that process of mitosis, dividing into two organisms. They also can, in fact, have a dinoflagellate bloom. When that happens, for these particular organisms, as part of their lifestyle, they do release a little bit of some toxic substances. When they release these toxic substances when they're in huge numbers, bad for other organisms that are in the water. They create what we call a red tide. The actual coloring of these organisms makes it seem like it's a little bit red. So these particular organisms produce these red tides by releasing some dangerous substances when they're in huge diatom blooms. And so some of these dinoflagellates, we just call them dinos for short, do release these toxic substances. The other thing that's really cool about these dinoflagellates is that some of the proteins they produce allow them to glow. We call that bioluminescence. Bioluminescence. And those deep water organisms where it's really dark have these same qualities as well. So these dinoflagellates, they show some relationships, at least in their DNA, to some of those other deep water organisms. And we'll talk a little bit more about bioluminescence in a couple class periods. The third and final type of organism that we're going to talk about are the zooxanthellae. It looks like it's pronounced or spelled Z-O-O. It is, but you don't pronounce it zoo. It's zooxanthellae. That's how we pronounce this particular term. It is a type of dinoflagellate, but it's a very unique type of dinoflagellate. This particular type of dinoflagellate actually lives with, that is inside, other animals. They live inside sponges, sea anemones. They live inside giant clams, corals. They actually are giving sugars to their host organisms. So they obtain food by doing photosynthesis. So they're a type of dinoflagellate that is not doing the heterotroph. It's not eating other things. They're just doing that photosynthesis. And they're living inside these other organisms because it's for protection. They don't have to worry about being eaten by a large organism if they're inside the coral. They're protected. And in this picture, you can kind of see these brownish spots. Those are groups of dinoflagellates. This is what actually gives coral its color. Corals do not need to eat. If you were to have corals at your house in a saltwater tank, you just need to have very, very high quality lighting. It's thousands of dollars. And if you have that high quality lighting, the corals will survive because of the dinoflagellates inside providing those sugars for those corals. This explains why most corals need to be up near the surface, near where there's plenty of light. It's the protection that they are getting these zooxanthellae from those particular corals. Next up, we'll talk about the animal-like protists. We call these animal-like protists the protozoans. Proto, kind of like, and zoan, animal. That's the zoo part. For these particular organisms, their structure, very diverse. Lots and lots of different kinds of structures, so we'll talk a little bit about these guys. The common link for all of them, and why we group these in this animal-like protist grouping, is that they have a single cell. These organisms are heterotrophs, but some also will do photosynthesis. It's a little bit different than what I said with the dinoflagellates. And that difference is important. Dinoflagellates do photosynthesis. They're autotrophs, but some will be heterotrophs. They're all heterotrophs, but some can also do that photosynthesis. So let's talk really quickly to wrap up about three different protozoans or animal-like protists. The first one are the foraminiferans. The foraminiferans, or for short, the forams. For these guys, the movement, they move a little bit differently. They have what we call pseudopodia. Pseudo meaning fake, Podia meaning feet. So they have fake feet that are actually sticking out through that cell membrane. It's kind of a projection of that cytoplasm on the inside of the organism. It's extending out. Not real feet, obviously, but it's this cytoplasm that extends out. And they use this to kind of move around. They will use it as a paddle. Their shell, you can kind of see in the picture here, it looks like it's got these little different bubbles. This is one individual organism. This is one individual organism. Here's another one. So these shells have these kind of different rooms sort of inside. Their shell's different. It's made up of calcium carbonate. That's Ca for calcium. And then a big C for the carbon, a big O for the oxygen, 3. So it's CaCO3. So it's calcium carbonate is what their shell is made up of. And that's the same substance that things like snails or clams' shells are made up of, as well as organisms like the corals. The coral skeleton is also made up of that calcium carbonate. How these particular organisms obtain food, again, I mentioned they are heterotrophs. I mentioned they have the extension of the cytoplasm sticking out here. So they use those fake feet, that pseudopodia, to actually capture and absorb some food particles that are floating around them. They form this network. Things that they eat, you know, these guys are still single-celled, but a little bit bigger. Things that they eat are things like diatoms. They're actually capturing those other protista. They'll eat bacteria, any small, microscopic particles that are floating in the water. Reproduction-wise, they will reproduce again through that process, since they are one single cell, of mitosis, dividing into two, growing, larger, dividing again. In situations where the conditions are right, they will reproduce in tremendously high amounts, forming huge numbers of these organisms. When those organisms deplete the calcium carbonate in the water, they die, they sink down to the bottom, and they form these huge areas of what we call foraminiferan ooze. A couple examples of places that you might be familiar with. Picture here of the White Cliffs of Dover over in England. These white cliffs are entirely made up of the shells of foraminiferans. So we're talking about microscopic single-celled organisms. These cliffs are hundreds of feet high. It's a tremendous amount of organisms living in this area that died and just piled up over hundreds of millions of years. And these particular organisms, now that the sea level has dropped, it's dried, and we have these white limestone cliffs. And any areas of limestone where we're harvesting that limestone to use as countertops or pathways in the garden, those limestone areas at some point had foraminiferans living in the waters above them. Their bodies, their shells sank down to the ground, and now we have the remnants of them as this limestone. The second type are the radiolarians. The radiolarians are pretty much microscopic. They are a little bit bigger than the other organisms that we talked about. One of the unique things about the radiolarians is that some of them will actually group together and form colonies that will stay together, working together. For the movement, for these particular organisms, very similar to the other animal-like ones, they also have those pseudopodia, except their pseudopodia is a little bit different. It's very, very thin, kind of needle-like, sticking out of the organisms. For their shell, again, shell very important for these guys, a little bit unique, slightly different kind of shell, very elaborate. I'll show you a picture here in just a moment. But their shell, like the diatoms, it's also made of silica. So it's elaborate, but it's also delicate because, well, it's glass-like. It's made of the same substance that glass is made up of, that silica. For how these organisms obtain food, they capture it using the pseudopodia that they use for movement, those thin needle-like projections of that cytoplasm. They are then heterotrophic. These guys do not do photosynthesis. And the last part here is that reproduction. Again, it is that mitosis, asexual reproduction. So these organisms, since they are one single cell, don't have egg cells or sperm cells. That wouldn't make sense. When they grow in huge numbers, they die. Their shells are going to sink down to the bottom, and they'll form, wait for it, radiolarian ooze. I know, shocking, right? but that's the kind of substance that they are forming, this radiolarian ooze in their reproduction. But the unique thing about the radiolarians is that because of this elaborate, delicate structure of their shell, we often find radiolarian oozes at a much deeper level. That is, they can sustain the pressure down at the bottom of the ocean much better than the other organisms' shells. So here's a picture. You can see that elaborate construction. This is one really blown up. There's a couple others in the back, so they're a bit smaller. This is one organism. The main cell body is going to be back here in this particular area. Another picture here of this one, and you can see that glass-like. It really looks. This is just a projection. It's not one of those pseudopodia sticking out here. It's one of those pieces of that particular organism. And then the last one here are the ciliates. Ciliates are actually organisms that you might be a little bit familiar with. The ciliates, how these particular organisms move, they move around using many hair-like cilia. Similar to how the dinoflagellates have flagella, the ciliates have cilia. And you can see the cilia in this photograph, and definitely in the drawing here, kind of sticking out, all these little hair-like projections sticking out here. For movement, that's what they use to move, the cilia. Locations, and this is where some of you might actually be familiar with these guys. They are large, actually. You can see these with the naked eye decently. These guys are found cruising over seaweed. So if you ever picked up some seaweed, you see these little teeny tiny things. They're still very small, but you can see them just moving along the surface of the seaweed. Very potentially could be these ciliates in bottom sediments and mud. Sometimes they're actually on the skin underneath the scales of fish organisms, and you can find them in these big groups working together as a colony. A unique thing about these guys' shells is that they don't have a shell. Very different than some of the other Protists that we have talked about. Food-wise and reproduction, these organisms use their cilia to capture that food, help sweep it towards the organism. So they're moving the cilia back and forth, and it creates a current, bringing water and therefore food particles closer and closer to them. And they therefore are heterotrophic, do not do photosynthesis. Reproduction-wise, again, it's one single cell. So these particular organisms do reproduce asexually through that process of mitosis. The most common form for these particular organisms is called a paramecium. That's the most common form, paramecium, which is one that many people have heard of before. Might not be as familiar, but this is one that some people have heard of because the paramecium is very common in freshwater. So we will actually have an opportunity to take a look at that paramecium. And that's it for the protists of the ocean. Just a handful of them, 3 plant and 3 animal-like protista. Make sure you understand the different shell types. That will definitely be on the test. Make sure you understand how they're getting their food, getting that energy. If it's photosynthesis, and eating other organisms, that is, they are autotrophs and then some heterotrophs, or are they heterotrophs and then do a little photosynthesis, or perhaps they're just solely heterotrophs. So that gets us into those animal-like characteristics. Of course, make sure you have just a little bit of an idea about how they're moving around as well. And we'll see you next class period.